go. Afternoon, folks. Hello there, welcome. Just getting us set up here. There we go. One particular large picture I'm going to be sharing with you in a little bit. Some very, very neat cave paintings. Now, got a couple minutes to make sure everybody else can make it, can show up. So as I like to do, got a little bit of a sneak preview for next week's program. Today's program is going to be cave art, and we're going to be going over some actual cave art and a lot of different reproductions of different types of art that we can do, including making and using our own paints. It's going to be a lot of fun. And next week, we're actually going to be focusing on stone tools, flint knapping. Now, with my paint set up here, it's a little tricky to show this process, but I'll show you. We're going to start with a large piece of rock like this, and this is basalt. We can actually find this in some places in Wisconsin. It's what we call an igneous rock. It's sort of lava made, though it's not lava itself. It's a little bit crystalline, a little bit grainy. It's not the best tool stone. It's certainly not like obsidian. So we're not going to be making tools quite like this, but we're going to be demonstrating things that you could very easily make at home with the right tools and the right materials. We're going to go over all the tools that you need to make your very own Stone Age stone tools. Just for a quick little finish to our preview here, take a good piece of stone like this and give it a little bit of a tap. And we'll turn something like that into a tool, maybe a burin. This could even make a good spear point. We're going to set this aside for now. Set it aside in a place where I won't stub my toe, because believe it or not, rocks are heavy. I heard my little alarm go here. So again, thank you for joining us for today's program, Cave Art 101. And well, we got a lot of stuff to talk about today, a lot of stuff to go over. If this is your first program, thank you for joining us here at Colossal Fossils. If you've been here before, you'll remember my name is Sean, Cave Sean, Mammoth Hunter, all perfectly acceptable. Well, today we're going to do a little bit of what I do here at the museum. We're going to do some experimental archaeology. Before we get to that, got a little bit of history, a little bit of different subjects to cover, and going to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So we're going to go through some recipes, different ingredients, different things, tools, where you can actually make your own paints at home. Hopefully I won't get too academic, too complicated. If I do, again, we'll make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. As you can see back here, we're going to do a little bit of Stone Age Bob Ross and actually test out some of these paints that we make. Now, before we get to the paints though, art. Art for tens of thousands of years, just like today, it encompasses a wide range of different things. Sculpture, carving, engraving, jewelry, paint, I mean, all kinds of things. Our Ice Age and Stone Age ancestors, of course, they liked decoration, just like us. They liked bright colors. They liked variation. If you look here, all of my clothes are different shades of browns, of earth tones. And when we're making clothing, we're making our bags, our tools, our everything out of natural materials. For a long time, pretty much the same types of materials, natural fibers, animal hides, furs, any little thing that we can do to decorate, to stand out from, the rest of our Stone Age brethren, to express ourselves, to be a little bit unique, is going to be something that we want to do. Now, cave art itself, cave paintings in particular, are difficult. They start showing up somewhere around 40,000 years ago, but people have probably been painting much, much older. There are some sites in Australia that might go back as far as 60,000+ years ago, but dating can be very difficult. Some of the materials used to make the paints are hard to date. They're hard to do a carbon date on. Some things it's very easy. Occasionally charcoal was used. Charcoal's carbon, so it gives us a very good date. But I mean, how many of our modern paintings would last 20, 40, 100,000 years? Very, very few. It's the same with Stone Age art. Much of it's just been lost to the rigors of time. Now, cave art, cave paintings, jewelry, etc., all the stuff we just mentioned, shows up all over the world at different periods. Everywhere there have been people, there's been some form of art. So just because we touch on something or demonstrate something a certain way today, or maybe skim past or don't talk about something, doesn't mean that it's not art, doesn't mean that you can't do it, and it doesn't mean that our ancestors didn't do it. It just means we've got a huge subject here. And where I'm going to start is a particularly interesting art style for myself. Starting around 40,000 years ago, we start to find a very interesting stone tool, which we'll talk much more about next week. We'll make a few of these. This is called a burin. A burin isn't much of a tool. The camera will focus on me. It's a stone flake that's been chipped in a specific way to give it a chiseled edge. You use this little point as an engraver. You just you scrape a little groove out. This can actually be used as a cutting tool, and they were very commonly used for cutting antler and bone, for needles, for harpoons, but also for beads, shells that have holes bored in them for beads. And actually, we now know things like eagle claws, seashells, bear claws were made into beads not only by our ancestors, by Homo sapiens, but also by Neanderthals. There's even cave paintings now that are attributed to Neanderthals rather than our own Homo sapien ancestors. Things like seashells are very popular because they're bright, they're shiny, they're colorful. And, if all you have to wear are these, brown and tan clothes, a couple of seashells will really make you flashy. It's sort of your, Sunday finest three-piece suit, circa 40,000 years ago. One of my personal favorite, here we have a turtle shell. Now this one's nice because it's bright, it's colorful, it's strong, it's durable. Yeah, it's a big, flashy thing that I can put on, and it could be seen from a distance. You know, everybody knows that's Cave Sean. I'm not going to wear it today, though, because I don't want to drag it through paint when we get to that in a minute. Now, another type of art that's actually really, really interesting to paleontologists, to archaeologists, is that uses that burren is actually engraving. We find a little bit more recently, because the materials, bone and antler and ivory that's been engraved with images using burrens. And these are kind of nice because they're a little bit more durable than paint. It's also a form of portable art. Whereas the cave wall, like we have on the background there, it's really hard to take the wall off the cave, put it in a backpack, and carry it with me when I go to, say, summer camp or to fish camp, or we get the mammoth and have to move the village, and you know, I can't take that art with me. But stuff like this I can. This is a musical instrument. You might remember us talking about this a little bit in a previous program, the noisy cricket. This was engraved with a burren. Well, this is a piece of horn, buffalo horn. We've also got a form of art that's still popular today, probably a little bit more in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe than in a lot of places in America, but we call this scrimshaw. This was done well back into the Paleolithic. And the way these are painted, you might think that you carve the groove out and then very carefully paint these in with a fine little brush, but in fact, it's all done in broad strokes. You use the point of the burren to carve out a deep groove with your image, just like you'd draw with a pen or a pencil. And you take paint, in this case red ochre, which we're going to talk about a lot today, and just paint over the entire thing with a little bit of animal fat and the pigment. And that animal fat, the oil, seeps into the wood and dries and holds that pigment in the glue. Then you take a scraper and you carve off all of the paint and the outer layer of wood that's a little bit stained, and it leaves behind these beautiful engraved images. And we find scrimshaw images like this done in bone as far back as 25 to 30,000 years. Very, very long time. Getting a little bit more recent in history, in the 20,000 year range, and even into the 15,000 year range, what we call the Magdalenian period in Europe, we start to find really ornate carvings. So this is a spear thrower, the atlatl that we talked about in the Mammoth Hunter program, but the end of it is actually carved to the shape of a mammoth. Now his trunk used to be a little bit longer. He got stepped on, lost a bit of his nose. His back foot is the spur of the spear thrower, and this is based on an actual Magdalenian European artifact. And the only difference between this one and the original is that the trunk of the original was actually the handle of the spear thrower, where because of the shape of the antler that I was working with, I had to adjust. But it's the same size, it's the same critter, and it was made the same way with stone tools. Now this took me about 60 hours of carving with stone tools. It was a long time, a lot of work. The fact that we find so many carvings, sculptures, beads, things like this, tell us that decoration, that art was very important to our ancestors. In fact, one bead, where'd it go? One bead like these, just simple round beads, a little bit of color on them, can take between 2 and 4 hours to carve out of a piece of bone or antler, or actually quite commonly during the Stone Age, mammoth ivory. There was one particular find in Eastern Europe, I believe it was about 12,500 years old, called Sangarman. And Sangarman had thousands of beads sewn on his clothing. Now, the clothing itself was long gone when the skeleton was found. There were traces of red ochre, this red pigment color that I used to paint my mammoths to decorate my own clothing. We're going to paint with a little bit. But he literally had thousands of beads, something like 12,000 beads found in this burial. From his hat, his coat, his pants, his boots, everything was just sewn, covered in these beads, just sewn in place. Now, each one of those beads takes a couple of hours to produce by hand with stone tools. So somebody put a lot of work, probably more than a year of work, into making all of those beads and producing that clothing. Now, that's not art. I would personally love to go back in time and see what it looked like originally, because the positions of the beads had all shifted over time, but we still know it was being done. Now, of course, if you want to make beads of your own, you can make beads out of anything you find that looks nice, even a piece of wood. This is a small wooden bead. And for yourselves, you're certainly welcome to use stone tools, but we're okay with modern tools. I won't tell anybody if you don't. Now, another example that we have, this little carving here, this was actually done on a piece of mineralized walrus tusk. This is 5,000-year-old walrus ivory. And this is sort of my own version of a Venus figurine. Now, Venus figurines get to be very common at certain points throughout the Paleolithic, throughout the Stone Age, and they're carvings of women, all different skill levels, some of them very recognizable. The most famous is the Venus of Willendorf. Some of you might have heard of that. We don't actually know what those were for, if they were goddess figurines, which is the original guess, if they were what I think, like this is sort of my Stone Age wallet photo. You know, we don't have photographs. It's really hard to carry a cave painting, and actually paintings of people are fairly uncommon until much more recently. I personally think that those carvings were sort of, you know, your caveman wallet photo of cave wife. When you go off on the mammoth hunt, you bring that with so you can remember who you're hunting for back at the village. But we really don't know. Now, before we move on to paint here, just some real quick examples. This is our Sangir Man inspired shoulder pouch. And these are all just sewn into place. But you can see with the dark brown color, the colors of the beads, it gives some really bright flash, some really nice contrast. And the same thing can, of course, be done with thread, with embroidery, with lighter colored hide. You know, the only limit is the imagination of the artist. And that brings us to, of course, paint. Now, if we're painting a cave, it's a little different than painting hide. If we paint leather, anything we can water down will work. Even cloth can be painted with this stuff. This is dye made from black walnuts. Black walnuts are really, really nice. They're a little out of season now. They come ripe in late summer, early fall. They kind of look like tennis balls hung up from the tree. They're large, almost like lime-colored fruits that hang up on these trees. The nut itself is actually edible and a little stronger than our European walnuts, but pretty tasty. They were an important food source to you know, early Wisconsinites, but the hull, the rind that you peel off to get to the nut is full of a juice that initially it looks kind of yellow, but it is an amazing natural dye. It will stain absolutely anything you get it on for weeks and weeks. Actually, while harvesting some to color my clothing, I got a bunch all over my hands. I put a handprint on a birch tree in my yard, and it lasted on the tree outside for more than 2 years. So if you do harvest black walnut, as you can see, gives you a nice rich color. Just beware, it will stain you and everything you touch and everything you love and everything you hate for years to come. for actual paint, this is our natural minerals that are available in Wisconsin. Got a little bit of white limestone, yellow ochre, pink catlinite, some red ochre, some overcooked red ochre, what we call a burnt umber, and then the black is actually charcoal. We're going to go through and make some paints with these here. Done up properly, they can give you some really nice color. Now, before we start actually making paint, we have to go over a little bit of an introduction of our ingredients here. Stone Age paints were made in a number of different ways with a number of different things. One of the more popular pigments is red ochre, the stone like this. Red ochre, it shows up in different places all over the world. It was very, very commonly used, and probably because it gives a nice color. Red is always an eye-catching, sort of eye-popping color to the human eye. And red ochre in particular is kind of nice because most paints, especially mineral paints, need what we call a binder. We're about to make that. Red ochre can be used without a binder. It's just not very stable, but we'll give you a little demonstration here. Good look for me, right? Now, to take a rock like that and turn it into paint takes a few steps. So, many of you in, say, art class are probably familiar with watercolor paints, like the little Crayola discs you get in a little plastic palette. You add some water, mix them up with the brush, and you can paint away. Those paints actually already have the pigment, which is why they're colorful, and the binder. My favorite binder is hide glue. Hide glue can be a little bit difficult to come across. To make hide glue, actually takes scraps of leather and rawhide that are too small for me to use for other things, and I boil them down until they're like a nasty jello. And then I dry little pieces of that out. I can grind it up and it mixes with water to save you a lot of mess and horrible smell and all of that. We're going to use today Knox gelatin. Knox gelatin is just an unflavored gelatin. It's like the base ingredient for Jell-O. You can usually find it in pretty much any grocery store, anywhere you have canning stuff for making jams and jellies. Chemically, it is the same stuff as hide glue, but it's just much, much more refined and much easier to work with. So we're going to just take a little bit of this. It doesn't take much. We're going to want about a quarter of a teaspoon, just a tiny little bit. And we're going to dissolve that in hot water with the help of my very not Stone Age thermos here. And we're going to set that aside because it takes a few minutes to really dissolve to get to where we want it. And then we'll go back to our talk of cave painting here. Now that quarter teaspoon, you're going to want to dissolve it in maybe 3 or 4 tablespoons. Even add a little bit more. It doesn't take a lot, especially if you're painting like on paper, something that you want to hang on the fridge. Reminder to all of you youngsters watching, mineral pigments, like what we're going to be working with here, and some of the modern equivalents that I'm about to show you, will stain things. So I'm sure, talk to your parents, they'll agree, we only want to paint on paper. We don't want Sean the Mammoth Hunter to get that phone call that little Timmy went and cave painted the entire hallway and permanently stained the walls. That's none of that. All right. Now you can see it's just a little bit here. It's good hot water, but it's just hot tap water. There's nothing special about it. We're going to set that aside for a few minutes now that it's stirred up to let it do its thing. Now back to our pigments. That red ochre has been used for at least 285,000 years. There's some circumstantial evidence that goes back to about 500,000 years ago that seems to indicate that pre-human species like Homo erectus were actually digging this stuff up to use it for something. We're not sure what. The theories about its original use was actually for sunblock and even for bug repellent. It's a little bit antibacterial. It's sometimes used even for tanning hides. You not only get a nice bright red color to your hide, but it helps to keep it from smelling if it's hot weather while you're tanning. Of course, if you cover yourself with this, you're going to be bright red. Everybody's going to notice you. You'll look sunburned, but you won't get sunburned. And bugs like mosquitoes have a hard time biting through it. I'm going to set that aside so I don't stain the computer. Now, red ochre was definitely used as paint both by Homo sapiens and Neanderthals for at least 40,000 years, probably a lot longer. There are cave art sites all over the world. Like I mentioned before, 40,000 years is about the limit. The oldest cave paintings we've ever discovered are about 65,000 years old, but there's some question about the dates, and it gets a little complicated. Now, as starting about 20,000 years ago, like with Sangarman with all the beads, ochre was actually used in burials as what we call a grave good. They would throw pigment over the body of the person that they were burying. A lot of anthropologists and archaeologists think it was an offering, something to the person could take with them to the next world. It wasn't like to make them look bright red before they buried them. It was something intended for the person to carry with them into the afterlife, into the spirit world. And that actually is an indicator that it was a very, very valuable substance. It was something very important to people. To make it into a paint, or in fact, any pigment into a paint, there's a couple things we have to do. The binder is the first step. And like I said, what we're going to use today is that Knox gelatin, very much like a hide glue. If you are looking for other alternatives, just simple Elmer's glue, in the same kind of proportions, just a little quarter teaspoon, little bit with a few tablespoons of hot water. You can dissolve it up and use that as your binder. This works reasonably well on paper. Of course, it can make a mess. You want to be careful. During the Middle Ages, and very likely much farther back, eggs were actually used. Egg white and egg yolk can both be used as binder. Your egg yolks will change your color a little bit, just like mixing colors of paint together to get a new color. A little bit of yellow in the yolk will lighten up darker colors, and it'll kind of change the shade of lighter colors, but it does work. If you use egg, you do want to water it down just like the other binders, and you don't want to save it. When it dries as paint, it doesn't smell. If it stays wet for a period of time, it can spoil. It can be very messy, so just a warning. It was very popular for what we call reliefs and illuminations in the Middle Ages. There are other types of binders that you can get and use out there that are a little less common up until the modern era, but it really comes down to anything that works like a glue to glue the pigments together that you can dilute or water down will work. Oil and animal fat is often used, but it's used because it's not water soluble. We're not going to use this today because it's incredibly messy and very hard to clean up here at the museum. We know this from previous experience. Now, when it comes to pigments, I talked about the red ochre, big rock like that. Wisconsin also has places where you can get this stuff. This is yellow ochre clay. And actually dug this out as moldable clay, just like you'd sculpt with in art class, out of a riverbank. This particular clump came from far eastern Iowa, but we can find stuff like this in Wisconsin too. You can actually change the color of this by roasting it in your campfire and oxidizing the iron minerals in it. But it works very nicely as a yellow color just on its own. To use it as a paint, to mix it with our binder, we want it to be really smooth, right? You don't want lumpy, clumpy paint, right? Any more than you want lumpy oatmeal. So without spilling it everywhere, show you, this is some of that red ochre after it's been ground up. And it's a very fine powder. It's almost textured like powdered sugar or talcum powder, right? I wouldn't want to put this on a donut. It'd probably be very crunchy. To get it to that condition using Stone Age technology isn't actually complicated. All you need is a flat rock and a not flat rock with a flat side. You put a little bit of that pigment on there and you grind it up until it's a smooth powder. You get all the lumps out of it. Now, we're not going to do that here today because it's very simple to do. And actually, for the most part, you're not going to have to grind up your pigments. If you do, you're going to use what we use here today, a modern art tool. Actually, modern-ish, goes back well into the Middle Ages, into the Roman era, thousands of years ago, but ceramics like this aren't really Stone Age. This is called a mortar and pestle, and a little bit of pigment in there, ground up like so, can function just as well as a stone ground pigment. When it comes to pigments, if you aren't lucky enough to be able to go out in your backyard and find a clump of red or yellow ochre, or even black walnut if you're painting something absorbent, stuff like this works great. Colored chalks, sidewalk chalk, paper chalks. These are just pastel chalks. And the nice thing about these, they come in colors that would make our Stone Age ancestors jealous. If you went back in time with a case of chalk like this, you could pretty much trade for anything you wanted, up to and including an entire mammoth. This would be something that was very, very high demand. Chalk can be a little bit tricky to mix with water, but you just keep at it and you'll get paint out of it before you know it. Other options, of course, you can just buy straight up pre-mixed watercolor paints, and well, you can paint whatever you want with them, right? It's art. You aren't limited and regimented to paint only woolly mammoths. Now, our Stone Age paint palette, again, it's just a rock. You take a little bit of that pigment, a little bit of the binder, mix it up on here, and then paint away. Now, since we are talking a lot about red ochre, I'm going to actually go ahead and mix up some red ochre paint with the mortar and pestle, though I want to show you here in a minute. There were definitely other colors used, and our Stone Age ancestors were better painters than I am. So don't judge me too harshly when we start painting here. Now, for the paint pigment itself, it really doesn't take much. We're going to do just about the same amount as we did of that gelatin, just about a quarter teaspoon. And, you know, if you're making your own paints, you can play with your measurements, you can play with your recipes. Artists often have their own recipes for their own paints. Throughout history, there's not a hard and fast rule to it. We're gonna just use a little bit here. There we go. Now our binder should be ready. It's been a few minutes. Now, It's completely non-toxic. Ideally, you want your paint, your powder, your color to be non-toxic too. But throughout history, poisonous things have been used to make paint, things like arsenic. I would personally suggest avoiding arsenic blue, but that's just me. Now, got that little 1/4 teaspoon of pigment. We're going to take about the same amount of our binder mixture, about a 1-to-1 mixture, 1/4 teaspoon. It's just enough to get it mixed together into paint. It really doesn't take much. The biggest mistake that people make when they're first doing this is actually pouring a whole bunch in, and then you end up with a big bowl of paint. You really don't need that. It's really, really very easy to just make a little bit more as you go, and a little bit goes a very long way. Now, because this has been previously ground, it mixes up very, very quickly. If you're grinding your own, say if you're grinding up some chalks, yeah, it'll take a little bit longer to make, but that's really all there is to it. I know I probably made it sound kind of complicated, but it's a little bit of some kind of glue to hold it all together, enough water to make it liquid so you can paint with it, and enough color to get it the color that you want. That's really all it comes down to. Clean this up here so I don't get paint everywhere again. Earlier in the week, there were footprints all the way to the back of the museum, but we won't talk about that. All right, now you can see we got some nice color there. Looks like I made a mistake while I was flint knapping, right? So we have not talked about paintbrushes yet. We're going to do that in a minute. Some of the oldest cave paintings that we find, and actually some of the most common types of cave paintings we find, are handprints. You know, the very first paintbrush that mankind used was just his born, grown, had it handy paintbrush. Sorry, it was a terrible joke. So we're just gonna throw a little red ochre color up here to see. Yeah. Some happy little red ochre mountains. Now, Bob Ross definitely did it better. Now, abstract symbols, zigzags, X's, handprints where their fingers are in weird positions or doing stuff like this show up quite a lot. In fact, one of the books that for those of you who are a little bit advanced in your research capacity, a little maybe toward middle school to high school, there is a book called The First Signs, which is absolutely fascinating study of cave art. The archaeologist who wrote it, she is postulating that these reoccurring abstract symbols, X's, zigzags, squiggles, things like this, are actually symbols, not writing, but sort of the stem, the seed that eventually becomes written language in the modern world. Fascinating theory. The most famous cave art, the most recognizable sorts of things are much more like this. This is a small segment of Lascaux Cave in France. It's often referred to as the Cave of Dreams. There are hundreds of cave paintings, some of them very, very detailed, some of them herds of animals, predators, hunting scenes. One very famous particular scene in the rock art there shows a hunter, a bison hunter, who is having a very bad day. The bison he speared is attacking him. And that particular painting was important to me in making my spear thrower, because it actually shows his spear thrower laying on the ground next to him. And it's shaped very much like this. Has an exaggerated end, it's got the cross peg on the bottom, and it's about the length of his arm. And we can theorize, postulate at least, that they were painting what they saw, so we can use some of those paintings to actually reconstruct the world that they lived in, which something that we can't do for any other species throughout the entire fossil record. Now, back to the painting. For those of you who are interested in painting at home, you can, of course, get yourself modern paintbrushes. And believe it or not, I do use modern paintbrushes from time to time. Not usually when I'm doing reconstructions, but for, you know, art, craft, hobby stuff. You can tell this particular paintbrush has been through a lot. If we're just interested in some paleo painting, hands and fingers style, finger painting is awesome. It's a lot of fun, but again, paper only. Make sure you cover up the table. We don't want to stain mom's tablecloth or, you know, grandma's fancy table. Believe me, I remember from when I was little, we don't want to do that. Now, Stone Age paintbrushes were made from all kinds of different things. Moss, sponges, animal fur. You can even take string, the types of stuff you'd use for rope, clumps of sort of fluffy plant like cotton balls, and use those as paintbrushes. My personal favorite, and one we're actually going to demonstrate for you here, is the feather paintbrush. Feather paintbrushes are awesome because not only are feathers easy to source, they're easy to find anywhere. They're very easy to make into a paintbrush, unlike, say, animal hair, horse hair, or boar's hair, which are very fancy paintbrushes today. All you need is a decent feather and a pair of scissors. We're going to walk you through this process here. Now, we have our handy dandy Colossal Fossil scissors, because we haven't shown you how to make the stone tools to make these yet. And I happen to have a goose feather. Now, first step, take your feather, and you can use tiny little bird feathers for this. I've used chickadee feathers, little tiny birds for painting very fine lines. I've even used things like turkey feathers, goose feathers, peacock wing feathers, even chicken feathers. If you get a bag of craft feathers from the hobby store that have bright colors to them, those will work too. Take our pair of scissors. We try to get the camera to focus for us. There we go. And you just want to clip off the end of that feather, just the very point, because you want most of this, because this is going to be your handle, but it's hollow inside. You can kind of see there. Sorry, the camera is being a little finicky today. So that's step one. Step two, this is your brush. But we've got to get this part of the brush down to the other end. So the very first step, we take our scissors and kind of push it through the feather there. So we're going to cut off just the little tip, maybe a little longer than your thumbnail, right? It doesn't have to be very big, doesn't have to be very much. And we're just going to snip that off. Set our scissors aside. All right, so to make this into a paintbrush now, we take that piece that we just snipped off, take the little extra fluffs that fell off and get rid of them, and put that into the end of the feather like so. Now, on this one, the feather is very, very hollow. It's a little bit long. My brush won't stick out properly, so I'm going to actually cut it back a little ways. Sometimes you have to do that. You have to make little adjustments. We can go ahead and save this extra piece and use that to make a finer, smaller brush at some point later if we need it. There we go. Now that fits in there better. Every feather is a little bit different. Sometimes you have to adjust them. Sometimes they work just right, but that is our ready to use paintbrush. You might have seen pens like this in historical movies, quill pens. They'd make pens out of feathers and actually more commonly out of reeds, marsh plants. And you can actually use those to paint the same way as you'd use them to write with ink. But the feather paintbrush we just made, let's give it a shot and see how well this works here. Get a little paint on there, and we'll see if I can be a Stone Age Bob Ross here. Without making too much of a mess. And as you can see, our feather is working pretty well. Now, this is absolutely something that would work just fine with modern watercolor paints or even thinned oil paints or any modern hobby shop, craft store kind of paint that you could get. You don't have to make your own paints. To do your own painting. Now, I will freely admit that I am nowhere near the level of artistic quality that our Lascaux cave painting ancestors were doing 20, 25,000 years ago. But I think everybody can tell what it is, right? Now, the reason for cave art seems to vary a little bit. The reason that they were painting things like this, but it can actually tell us quite a lot of neat things about our ancestors. Of course, they were painting a lot what they saw. They were painting hunting scenes, what we'd call, action scenes. There are even instances where we have indication that people of all ages are painting. It's not just the cavemen, like sort of the Victorian image of the 25 to 35-year-old Stone Age man, the shaman, goes down into the cave with the torch and paints, and no one else gets to see it. It's something everybody's doing. We actually got an instance of handprints, very small handprints from probably a 3-year-old child that was, they dipped their hands in red ochre and they slapped them up against the wall and left their handprints on the wall of the cave. But they did it 6.5 feet off of the cave floor. What that tells us is that the kid was there, the little kid was there painting with their parent. It was, it was a family thing. They put their hands in the red ochre and then mom or dad lifted them up over their head so that they could, up on the wall, 6.5, 7 feet off of the floor, even though they're only, 3 feet tall. So everybody cave painted. Many of the handprints we find are from teenagers, from boys and girls both, men and women. They, of course, seem to be decorative. It was something I like doing. Maybe each person's handprint is sort of their signature, just them leaving their mark on the world for future generations. Personally, I think a lot of them are stories. Now, the image of our Stone Age painter going down into the depths of a cave with a torch is a little bit inaccurate. They often, or they more likely would have used things like this. So this is a kudlik, or a carved stone oil lamp. You can see it's full of animal fat. Now, we're not going to take the next 10 minutes to start a friction fire here. I'm going to use a very modern technique. It's about as Stone Age as my thermos. but we'll get this lit. Hopefully the wick hasn't been completely burned out. Oh, it may not light for us. Yeah, my wick is a little burned out. To move this up a touch and try again. Sorry about that, folks. It was actually lit before and burned down on me. There we go. So this, you can see, actually gives off quite a bit of light. This is our Stone Age flashlight. You can imagine the flicker of that flame in a cave held up to the walls with our cave paintings. I don't know, I've got all the lights on here, so it takes away from it a little bit. You can see the glow of the flame. Imagine as that candle flickers, the glow against the paintings in the cave wall in a dark cave, it would make them move. The texture of the rock, the angles of all the paintings being different as the storyteller moves the light across the wall of the cave. It would almost be their version of television. You could imagine our Ice Age elders telling the story of the great mammoth hunt to the kids, to the next generation, as they take them down through the cave. They show them the journey that they took, where they had to leave the village, other animals that they hunted and came across along the way, the journey that they took, where they found mountain streams full of fish and had to eat supper. The part of the journey where they were faced with a giant short-faced bear, and all of them had to fend off a 12-foot tall bear with their spears. Pictures of the great herds of game they saw, horses, buffalo, oryx, and actually facing down our woolly mammoth, like we talked about last week. If you don't have television, if you don't have radio, electricity, even books, being able to pass down your experiences, your traditions, your story to the next generation becomes very important. And in my mind, that's probably where art originated, not just in decoration, but in the ability to leave our mark and to pass that experience on to the next generation. Now, before we wrap up here and open things up for some questions, I just wanted to let you know real quick. On Tuesday, somebody asked me about cave art in Wisconsin, and I didn't have a specific site. Most of the research that I do on cave art is Australian, European, and Asian sites, kind of as the migration went through. But I would like to let everybody here know today, we do in fact have cave art right here in Wisconsin, in Crawford County, an area that was within the driftless region, the driftless zone, where the glaciers didn't come down. It dates to about 690 AD. So that's the Dark Ages in Europe, about 300 years after the fall of Rome. So it's not quite Paleolithic, but it's some really neat stuff. There's deer, people, birds, a bunch of abstract shapes spread throughout 3 chambers in a cave. The front chamber of the cave actually appears to have had people living there. There's campsites, places where they cooked some deer and actually made torches with birch bark to go down into the caves. And the second chamber actually had a moccasin, an actual clothing artifact, which is very rare for this region. It was the first and best preserved moccasin found north of the Ozark region. A couple other sites, there's a Larson Cave in Crawford County, about 20 miles from Tombstone Cave. And then there's a Samuels Cave in La Crosse County, but unfortunately, since that was discovered years and years ago, there's been some vandalism, and the cave art itself has been covered over by people carving initials and graffiti. if you want a really nice sort of afternoon out in the park, Wyalusing State Park actually has effigy mounds. It's a beautiful state park. I've been there and actually seen the effigy mounds before. They really look like mounds, like hills, unless you can see them from above, but they have really neat photographs and drawings of what they're all supposed to be, things like bears and serpents. Really, really worth a visit if you're looking for a good sunny afternoon at a Wisconsin State Park. Now, I did hear my alarm. I know we're coming up toward that the end of the program time. I want to ask if anybody had any questions or wants me to go over any recipes or anything again. Yeah, go ahead.
How did they make the paint?
Well, they made it just like I made it. They would take their binder, usually something like glue, or if they were using a clay, a lot of times clay kind of sticks together on its own, and they would just mix water into it. They would grind it on a stone instead of in that mortar and pestle. Flat rocks like this. You can actually see on this rock, it's still got some red color on it for making paint. And of course, if they were less concerned about making a horrible mess than I am here in the museum, a little bit of animal fat, a little bit of grease, which, lard would work. I actually use suet, which is what you use to make bird feeders. You roll suet in like seeds and fruit and stuff like that and hang it up for the birds to eat. They would just mix powder in with stuff like that. If you do want to make your own paint, probably the easiest thing is going to be that Knox gelatin, like I talked about, or just a little tiny bit of like white glue. It's got to be water soluble. It's got to be able to dissolve in water. You just use a little bit of that, and that'll stick your paint together really well. Definitely remember, paint on the paper there. I can see you got some white walls behind you. We don't want any handprints on the walls, right?
Well, I got some paper right next to me.
Oh, perfect. Looks like you're already on your way to being an artist.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's the thing with this, of course. It's art. The only limit to what you draw, what you do with it, is what you can imagine. Our ancestors seem to have often drawn what they experienced and what they saw, and so they weren't limited by the subject so much as they painted what they knew. Since we've got a little bit of paint left here, I think we'll go ahead and give a signature. Of course, my reminder alarm starts going as soon as I cover my hands in paint, right? So we'll see if we can sign our work. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, then I'm going to just clean up caught me red-handed. Clean up my my paint here real quick, and then for those of you who are interested in seeing or in learning more about real, genuine cave paintings, of course, Google and Wikipedia are great resources. If you head to your local library and want to see if they can find some really good books for you. They got a little bit more academic, but I'd still like to recommend these because they've been excellent resources for me. The First Signs by Genevieve von Petzinger. She talks about the origin of language. She goes through dozens and dozens and dozens of actual sites, what they look like, what the conditions are, where they are. It's really fascinating stuff from an experimental archaeology aspect. And a quite a large book, but definitely interesting. You can tell I use this for resources quite a lot. The Nature of Paleolithic Art by Dale Guthrie is another one that, again, probably a little advanced for some of the younger fellows, but I wholeheartedly encourage anybody of any age who's interested to take a look at these books and at least see what they have to offer. They're absolutely fantastic books on cave art and Paleolithic carvings and sites throughout the world. So thank you all very much for joining us here today at Colossal Fossils for cave art. I hope you learned a lot. I hope that you at least, even if you buy some modern paints, try to make your own paintbrushes,
Bye.
this out, and make some art. Next week, like I said, way back at the beginning, we're going to do some stone tools. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to break some rocks with rocks. So look forward to seeing everybody back here for that next week. And thank you so much for being here. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.